welcome to my presentation. My name is David and I am a student of Scandinavian Studies, and for the topic of my presentation I chose projection, sources, religion. And when choosing this topic I immediately thought of Adam of Bremen's work Gesta, Hammaburgensis, Ecclesiae, Pontificum, which is a totally normal thing to do, I believe. And this work is seen as a primary source on Old Norse religion because it gives us the impression of an eyewitness account of pagan celebrations at Old Uppsala, in which is now the modern country of Sweden. But as a Christian source, can it really be considered primary? So I consulted different definitions of what a primary source is thought to be, and it seems that most importance is put onto whether a source provides direct evidence or first-hand testimony concerning a topic or event. So, while Adam of Bremen claims to base his descriptions on eyewitness testimony, I will return to that, he himself lives outside of the context that he describes, and is not documented to have visited the northern lands himself at all. So, does its position as a contemporary description of a pagan Scandinavian context legitimize the Gesta Hammaburgensis as an objective description of what actually happened? Or should the text be seen within its historical, political, religious, and gendered context? Well, I would say obviously it should. So, what exactly is the Gesta Hammaburgensis, and what does the author project onto the events, beliefs, lands, and peoples that he describes? Well, the work consists of 4 books, the fourth of which focuses mostly on Scandinavia and the rest of the Nordic sphere. And it was written in the second half of the 11th century, so at the same time when Christianity expanded its influence on Northern Europe. The Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, the one that Adam worked for, was responsible to missions to the north, since it was the closest geographically, as we can see on this map here. The title, Gesta Hammaburgensis Ecclesiae Pontificum, means deeds of the archbishops of Hamburg-Bremen, and it points directly to male agency, since these archbishops were men. The work is intended to be a description of the attempts at Christianizing the North by these archbishops and their missionaries, and this missionary work is then presented as a male enterprise. This enterprise of bringing Christianity to the people is also known as Legatio Gentium, a theme described by Lukas Grzybowski in his chapter Female Characters and the Meaning of History in Adam of Bremen's Gesta Hammaburgensis. He writes that women are presented in a work whenever they are useful to the story, or when they actively work against it. This creates a binary opposition between the good Christian women and the bad pagan women, but neither of them are really given agency. Instead, Grzybowski sees them as literary tropes used by Adam of Bremen to project Christian values onto symbolic individuals. So, to justify the religious as well as political expansion of Hamburg-Bremen, the Gesta Hammaburgensis had to be written in a way which did exactly that, justify it, and reminds the target audience, which consisted primarily of learned Christian men, of the importance of bringing Christianity to the north. And the pagan people of the north had to be presented in a way that would not only show readers how much these people were in need of conversion, they also had to be described in terms which would be understandable to a Christian audience. So this has resulted in the use of stereotypical literary images, inspired by classical mythology and biblical stories. But also this meant that an androcentric Christian worldview was projected onto peoples who were not classical pagans and not Christians. For a course on pre-Christian religions in Europe, which I followed at Stockholm University, I had read a critical article on the trustworthiness of Adam of Bremen, which was written by Anders Hultgård. As I mentioned before, Adam claims to have based his description of the pagan north on an eyewitness testimony, and Hultgård questions these claims and writes instead that Adam's description of the pagan celebration at Uppsala are not intended to be just a description, but instead a polemic Christianized retelling using mythological tropes and conventions from Roman contexts, known as Interpretatio Romana. So, in the following, I will focus on multiple things that Adam of Bremen projects in his work, And while Hultgård provides a helpful theoretical basis, he doesn't really focus on the position of women or gender, and neither does Adam himself, which is obviously problematic, but also to be expected from two male authors. So besides Hultgård's emphasis on Christian values and religious vocabulary as the most important projections, I also want to focus on the projection of an androcentric worldview that comes within a medieval, learned monastic context. And finally, I want to discuss two more layers of projections, namely the views of later translators and transcribers, and of modern and postmodern scholars and readers. So, the classical vocabulary that is used by Adam of Bremen to describe a non-classical pagan tradition contributes to the projection of a view on pagan religion that already corresponds to existing Christian views on paganism. So when describing the activities at Old Uppsala, Adam uses the word templum, which suggests the existence of a central religious building, and calls the ritual specialist sacerdotes, meaning priests. And not only does this suggest the existence of a separate priestly class in Scandinavian society, which is negated by other sources who tell us that actually secular leaders called the Gobi were the ones also in charge of religious rituals. And it also gives the impression that religious specialists were all men. Also, the gods worshipped in Uppsala are presented in comparison to Roman gods. For example, Odin, or Wodan, is described as Vodanem verus culpunt armatum sicut nostri Martem. So they depict Wodan with weapons, as we do Mars. Well, this doesn't always correspond to depictions of Odin in the archaeological material, as we can see here, this depiction of Odin riding his eight-legged horse Sleipnir from the Alskog runestone. It doesn't really look similar to this classical statue of the god of Mars, but by presenting Odin in this way, it does create a image that is easier for Christian readers to imagine him. So, a Christian and Roman view of religion is thus projected through the choice of language. A central religious building, as well as a separate priestly class, reflects the reality of Adam of Bremen and his religious context within the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, but not necessarily the reality of the places he describes. So when it comes to Christian values, as mentioned before, binary opposites are created between good Christians and bad pagans. The pagans are presented as wild, barbaric, worshipping false gods, while the Christians are the ones bringing them civilization through the word of God. The beliefs of Scandinavians are not presented as a different form of religion, but as superstition and idolatry, from a Christian viewpoint. So while the pagan beliefs had to be presented as different, similarities made between these beliefs and Christian ones also served as a useful way for Adam to show that these people were actually worthy and capable of becoming good Christians. Now, an important projection that is omitted by Anders Hultgård, but picked up by Lukas Grzybowski, is the projection of an androcentric worldview. So already the title, Deeds of the Archbishops, points to the emphasis on male agency. The focus is on the deeds of men, and women are only very briefly mentioned when Adam sees them as relevant for the development of his story. Grzybowski sees the focus on male agency as typical for a medieval monastic environment that Adam lives and works in. This context was not only devoid of women because of patriarchal power structures, but also because of the separation of men and women in a monastic environment. So, men like Adam were living apart from female coexistence. This obviously would make it difficult, if not impossible, to relate their masculine experiences of the world and religion to feminine ones, which can be compared to what Amina Wadud writes on the positioning of male lived realities as universal within an Islamic context. If a woman or non-binary person, for example, had been tasked with describing the deeds of the archbishops of Hamburg-Bremen, perhaps we would have had a completely different view on the socio-political situation and on the pre-Christian religions described. And perhaps the important actors of this archbishopric would not even be the archbishops at all. But projection within the work of Adam of Bremen is not the only projection at play when in regards to a historiographic work from the 11th century. So, The original manuscript has not been preserved. Instead, a few later versions exist, held at various libraries, like for example the Codex Vindobonensis 521 at the National Library of Vienna, dated to the 13th century. So these new versions were written in new historical context, which could result in the original messages being interpreted differently. Information could be added or omitted depending on what is seen as important by the editor. However, the authors of later manuscripts are presumed to be men, which would suggest that they upheld the masculine framework of the original Gesta Hammaburgensis. Translations of the work into a variety of languages have also been made, which means that the original Latin text had to be adjusted to fit into the vocabulary and cultural context of the people who spoke the language. In translation, like in copying, the authors can, consciously or not, project the worldview of their time, gender, and class onto the work. And the dichotomy of pagan versus Christian women presented in Gesta Hammaburgensis could furthermore serve as a reinforcement of gender roles, reminding women that they should stay true to their Christian faith in order to be considered useful to history. One could argue that Adam himself cared more about their religion than their gender, at least this is what Grzybowski argues in his text, but that doesn't mean that the work couldn't have been interpreted as a cautionary tale to keep women under patriarchal Christian control. But if there is one arguably positive thing about the projection of views onto a historiographic work, it is that it can result in different interpretations of it, depending on what the person interpreted it decides to focus on. I have already tried to show this by providing different areas of focus by Hultgård and Grzybowski. One of them focuses on the description of pre-Christian ritual, while the other focuses on the role of female figures as literary tropes. So, when analyzing an 11th century work, we in the 21st century should stay aware of the context in which it was written, but also of the context in which we read it. However, with new developments in society and academia, new lenses could be used to look at work of Adam of Bremen. It can, for example, be looked at as a work on the expansion on Christianity within Europe, and be compared to later so-called colonizing missions. These lenses, which are used to look at this work, could then also be analyzed. So, while the work intended to put pre-Christian Scandinavia in a negative light, it is now also being used as a source for the revival or reinterpretation of a modern version of Norse paganism. So now new pagan celebrations are being held at Old Uppsala, the place described by Adam of Bremen, and I have been to such a celebration myself. And this shows that even if the author intends to project a specific view onto this topic, it is possible to read between the lines and extrapolate something else from it. This means that a feminist or queer reading of Gesta Hammaburgensis could definitely be possible. I would even say necessary, especially since most of the academic literature on the work is still written by men, even work concerning women. So that was everything I had to say, and as a final thought, I have added this statement for reflection. In a medieval historiographic context, projection is a concept which is present on multiple levels. Can this projection be justified? If not, would you say there are any contexts in which projection can be justified or even necessary?